Good afternoon. My name's Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. I have the pleasure of being your host for this 9th Colin Crampthorne Memorial Lecture. As many of you will know and remember, Colin was much loved Chief Constable of West Yorkshire at the time of the 7/7 bombings, last Deputy Chief Constable of the Old Royal Ulster Constabulary and first Acting Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. He was taken from us tragically early by cancer, still remembered with much fondness. We're delighted that his widow, Lynn, is here with us today online and with other members of the family. I know you'll all wish to, on behalf of everyone here, to wish them all the very best and to thank them for continuing to be patrons of this lecture, which would, I know, have meant so much to Colin. As I say, this is the 9th such lecture, and our guest of honor today, our keynoter, Matt Pottinger, is Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. He was previously distinguished journalist with the Wall Street Journal, and then was distinguished, joined the US Marine Corps and won combat decorations for his service in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's one of the leading authorities in the US government on China, and that is why uniquely today we are innovating here at Policy Exchange, because as a more than fluent Mandarin speaker, Matt's address today will be delivered in Mandarin for the sake of audiences across the world, and indicating his belief that China is not defined solely by the People's Republic of China and its representatives, that there is a wider engagement to be had with audiences across the world, Mandarin speaking and others. So good evening to anyone coming in from the Indo-Pacific region and China in particular. Good morning to all of you in Washington. Matt, as I say, will make his remarks first in Mandarin. We'll then open the floor to questions for 35 minutes or so of questions. As I say, we're delighted to be doing this here at Policy Exchange with the importance of this subject of the wider Indo-Pacific region and China in particular. We have our own Indo-Pacific Commission chaired by former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, which will be publishing in the near future its finding in its work, also because of the particular importance of this subject and because of the proximity to the US presidential election. We're having actually two Crampthorne Memorial Lectures in close succession, one obviously the one today by Matt Pottinger, the other next week by Dr. Kurt Campbell of the Asia Group, one of the leading authorities on Asia from the last Democratic administration of Barack Obama. And of particular significance because people are increasingly aware in this country that in an era of polarization in America, the area of the Indo-Pacific China is one subject where discussion and even a measure of consensus is still possible in the United States. So thank you to Matt Pottinger for honoring us in this way. We look forward to hearing your unique address and insights, and then open to wider discussion. Thank you, Matt.
我非常感谢 Dean Godson 先生和 Policy Exchange 邀请我主讲第9届 Colin Crampthorne 年度讲座。我们都盼望着能共聚一堂，面对面交流的那一天。而新的疫苗和疗法即将出现，让我倍感乐观。通过西敏寺与白宫跨大西洋的视频连线，让我们暂时用想象来替代。我希望把准备好的话讲完后，热烈的讨论会接踵而来。据说，英国和美国是被共同语言而被分隔开的国家。看来用汉语发言，更能成为两国之间的桥梁。实际的情况是 ，Godson 先生让我炫一炫说中文的本事儿，拼拼收视率。他知道之前我的中文5次演讲，视频点击超过100万。 可能他还知道，之后我为里根总统研究所录制的英文视频，连我的下属在内也没几个人关注。看来 Godson 先生是这样算计的：说中国话的洋鬼子，可能比洋鬼子说的任何话都会更卖座。急来之则安之，有道是外行看热闹，内行看门道，大家各取所需。用汉语发言还有另一个好处，中国朋友也能直接参与这场对话。中国与世界的关系是当今国际上越来越受关注的话题。要说明这场对话的重要性，不妨先回顾一下历史。形势日渐紧迫。18世纪末，一个上海相隔远离英国的地方，一些高瞻远瞩的人起草了一部宪法，主张限制公权，提倡民权，希望开辟永久的民主之路。我所说的是波兰，你会惊讶，18世纪末的波兰历史没被选进各位的高中课本，大家不必感觉难堪。彼时，后来更加著名并且至今仍为合众国最高法律的美国宪法也刚诞生没几年。不同的是，波兰宪政实践却被扼杀在摇篮里。问题出在外力干预。部分波兰贵族害怕新宪导致他们特权的丧失，于是求助俄国，复辟旧制。俄国女皇 Catherine the Great 借机入侵，夺取了波兰东部，普鲁士占领了波兰西部。俄国在平定了曾经是美国革命英雄的波兰军官 Kosciuszko 的起义后，1795年与普鲁士和奥地利联手，完成了对波兰和立陶宛的最后瓜分。年幼的波兰联邦从此在地图上消失。提到波兰失败的变法有2个原因。一是提醒大家，民主政府虽然具有先天的合法性和实践的成果，既非战无不胜，亦非历史的必然。二是专制政权对自由社会的干预，不仅没有江河日下，反而甚嚣尘上。若要阻止外力干预，最好有地利。可惜对波兰来说，地利是个奢望。18世纪波兰的邻邦都是当时的欧洲强国，而美国却受到大西洋和太平洋的环抱，享有哺育民主宪政求之不得的优良条件。然而，在信息网络时代，专制政权可以将虚假信息灌输到他国的公共舆论当中，并通过自我更新的运算程式去广为传播。如今，重洋海峡的天然阻隔能够抵御这样的干扰吗？如果自由的主权国家放任自流的话，当然不能。许多国家，包括民主国家在内，正在经历实实在在的考验。考验的是我们自身抵御高科技专制政权隐蔽的强力腐蚀的能力。听起来很奇怪， 因为专制政权只占少数，但是他们具有支配本国全部资源的能力，他们相互借鉴，甚至经常相互协调。国家经济实力并非赢得虚拟网络战的前提条件。我们看到莫斯科和德黑兰指使的黑客们正在千方百计地削弱人们对正在进行的美国大选的信任。在此，没有任何政权比中国共产党更有能力去影响他国的政策以及国外民众的认知和选择。说真的，我们早该料到这一点。中共取得内战的胜利，并非完全得力于军事战斗力，而是借助其在思想意识以及实际行动上对敌人的渗透和操弄。这就是为什么当下中共的领导人狠抓统战工作的原因。统战工作的主要特征是不透明，顾名思义，奥秘就在名字里。统一战线是一个在开放社会找不到同类的概念，中共领导人把它称为法宝。只要统战需要，9000万党员都必须支持。中共统战部门干部的数量是美国国务院外交人员的4倍。中国外交部负责与各国政府进行外事活动，统战部则在搜集他国情报，对海外居民施加影响。他们专门关注外国的精英阶层和机构。实际上，统战人员是集情报、宣传和心理诱导于一身的通才。听上去很像在讲笑话，不过中共统一战线可绝不是开玩笑，因为它直接影响到你和我。原来心理诱导的原材料就是大数据。这就是为什么中共给世界各地数以百万计的外国公民建立了数字档案。根据上个月披露的材料，一个中国数据库中包含了超过240万个外国公民资料，包括许多今天在线的各位听众。这说明中共将传统的列宁主义与强大的数字监控新工具相结合的宏大部署。对我们公开和私下的数据进行收割建档的企业是深圳振华数据信息技术公司。据说公司的首席执行官称之为攻心战。根据公司网站披露，其产品的买家是中共国安系统。振华汇编的人事档案几乎囊括了地球上每个国家、王室、议会、法官、文职人员、科技专家、新兴企业家、海军上将、军舰水手、教授、智囊团成员、中央和地方官员，不一而足。甚至儿童也不放过，这符合北京无孔不入的政治斗争习惯。振华在统一战线里并不是什么拔尖的角色，甚至可能只是商业投机，认定中共会来买单， 实际上，实力更加雄厚的中国科技公司，包括一些著名应用程序开发商，能量要大得多。建立档案的嗜好是列宁主义政权的特征，资料的使用一如既往，用于施压、勒索、奖惩、威胁、恐吓、奉承、污蔑、分化和征服。与以往不同的是，我们自己创造了条件，使独裁者能够轻松地搜罗到如此大量的私人数据，甚至包括那些从未涉足过中国的人。我们将知识产权、政府文件和私人生活任意公开，像本摊开的书。我们用智能手机聊天、搜索信息、购物、浏览、从事网上金融、导航、社交、宗教信仰到相互倾诉，这些信息的散布，一如伦敦双层巴士排放的尾气，使得利用网络对我们思想和行为的监控易如反掌。中国共产党已经重新安排了举国部署，用来效力用数字手段扩大党的力量和影响。然而，收集和利用大数据的最终目的是什么？北京在试图影响我们什么？简而言之，中共的目标是通过软硬兼施，使得个人选择甚至国家政策陷入某种有利于北京为所欲为的心态。这是一种认知上的背离，既软弱又恐惧，得意自满而又无能为力。仿佛今天说认为中共构成威胁还为时过早，可明天又说中共确实是威胁，但是大势已去，为时已晚。陷入这种特定心态，就像是吞了《黑客帝国》中的蓝丝药丸一样，被幻象所征服。中共是如何做到的呢？这就是统一战线的宣传战和攻心战的厉害之处。中共的海外宣传有两个一以贯之的主题：未来属于我们，你越早配合越好。同时，我们跟你们没什么不同，别担心。这两句片词在历史上共同构成了所有列宁主义运动宣传的核心。新西兰学者布雷迪是揭露统战伎俩的先驱，他指出中共的一带一路和人类命运共同体是这类运动的经典样本。他称统战是一种工具，专是腐蚀和侵蚀我们的政治制度，削弱我们的力量，制造我们的分裂，窒息我们媒体的批评声音，并且用钞票堵住我们精英的嘴巴，使他们成为中共的维护者。当然，骗术并不总是有效，会被真相戳穿。一带一路项目的巨大浪费和腐败就是一个例子。当骗术达不到目的，中共经常诉诸恐吓和胁迫。以香港为例，去年上百万示威者游行抗议北京实施更严酷的控制。如果中国特色社会主义是未来， 看来香港示威者宁愿活在当下。对此，北京采取了另一套方案，拆毁了邓小平一国两制的框架，剥夺了使香港成为亚洲最兴旺城市的自治。然而，上面说的都不是陷入恐慌的原因。的确，西方正在经历周期性的自我疑虑，极端的政治思潮同时出现在左右两端。有些愚蠢的主张属于奥维尔说的只有知识分子才会去信的范畴。我们需要回顾常识，在外交政策方面，为了维护主权、促进稳定和减少误判，特朗普总统确立了2个值得强调的原则，这就是对等和坦率。对等其实非常简单，如果他国损害我国利益，我将以彼之道还之彼身，既合理又通俗，包括针对潜在的侵略者。这是防御性的策略，指根于公平和威慑的基本概念。坦率的概念是，当大家诚实的和公开的谈论朋友、对手和自己时，民主制度是最安全的。这可能需要一些时间来适应。当里根总统准备在柏林发表演讲时，有些幕僚拼命劝他删掉一句不太好听而且有点伤人的话。幸好里根总统研发自新，说出了那句在他总统生涯中最著名的话：戈尔巴乔夫先生推倒这堵墙。有人会说，对抗性的言论让国家相互敌对。美国的外交使团善于把这个陈旧观念伪装成谦恭的政策，而骨子里却反映了一种自大心态。其中的假设是，其他国家的行为都是美国说了些什么，做了些什么的反应。聪明的对手于是顺水推舟，利用我们自己的伪善制约我们。把讲真话说成挑衅，是独裁者禁止民主国家发言的手段，经常能够得逞。里根总统在 Guildhall 曾说，这是自由国家遭受的第一个也是最严重的挫败。当自由人民停止向其对手说真话时，其实就是欺骗自己。实际上，坦诚不公就是通过减少战略误判以促进和平。坦诚不公也适用于我们的内政，不能有双重标准。当 Louis Armstrong 作为美国国务院文化大使的苏联演出时，他坦率地谈到了美国的种族歧视。当里根总统著名地称苏联为邪恶帝国时，他在同一篇演讲中提到了美国自己的，包括反犹太主义和奴隶制在内的邪恶遗存。因此，我本着友好、乐于反思和坦率的态度，请中国的朋友们研究一下贵国政府对维吾尔族和其他少数宗教群体的政策，追问一些真相，问一问，为什么《经济学人》本周封面文章中称这些政策为反人类罪和违反 当今世界上最广泛认同的原则，即人类个体享有自由和尊严的权利。作为一个反恐战争中参与了3场战斗部署的海军陆战队队员，我可以告诉你，新疆发生的一切在道德上同反恐没有任何关联之处。这恰恰是1948年中国外交官张鹏春参与起草联合国世界人权宣言时要根除的对人权的侵犯。在中国任何的哲学、宗教或道德思想中，也不可能找到支持在中国的土地上建立集中营的做法。在2006年癌症去世前，本讲座以之命名的 Colin Crampon 是西约克郡的警长。他处理了英国历史上最出名的恐怖主义案件，从北爱尔兰汽车炸弹袭击到2005年伦敦自杀式袭击。当一个人白天的工作是与邪恶斗争，夜深人静的时候，难免思索人性的善恶。作为一位手不释卷的读书人，他偶尔会特别去翻看 C.S. Lewis 的著作。听说他在 Lewis 的《地狱来鸿》中找到了特别的慰藉。这是 Lewis 杜撰的一篇精彩绝伦的独白。主角 Screwtape 是一名为撒旦服役的妖魔。顺便说一句 ，John Cleese 几十年前就录制了这本书的完美音频版，可以在 YouTube 上找得到。听说 Andy Serkis 也录制了一个版本。没有急弯，没有里程碑，没有路标，通往地狱的最安全的路是缓坡又缓坡，脚下轻松又柔软。我估计 Colin 是从这样的认知中得到希望和勇气的。如果正确辨别邪恶，使他无所遁形，就会发现邪恶其实是脆弱的，甚至是虚张声势的。让邪恶暴露于光天化日之下，贴上标签，能使人免受诱惑，摆脱恐惧。正如我的朋友 Tony Dolan 说的那样，制度性的邪恶有着根本的矛盾。它同时可以强大无比，却又脆弱不堪，因此它内侵略本性，终将导致自我毁灭。他意识到自身的道德荒谬，就像在善的海洋里的随时倾覆的一叶扁舟。邪恶最害怕的是公之于众的真相。那就让我们大声高呼吧，在此向我们的好警察 Colin Crampon 和全世界无私正直的公务员举杯。我们感恩，感谢你们的奉献，谢谢。
Matt, thank you for a truly brilliant and memorable address. You've now very kindly agreed to answer questions. Just 2 items of protocol here. Please put your virtual hands up. Please also look into the camera when you're speaking because of the exigencies of the virtual events. And final house rule, which all of you will be aware of, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organization before pronouncing. David Brunstrom, if you could just restate for the record your name and organization you wanted to ask a question. David, we can't we can't hear. Can I just ask, we've had a number of people have been texting in to me. Some want it to be asked anonymously, Matt, so if I can use Chairman's privilege to ask on their behalf. A little more detail. Is the strategy, the CCP strategy of wolf diplomacy, is it just, is it too far gone now? Could you say in a bit more detail, they ask, about what, in your view, from the US administration's perspective, the countermeasures should be?
Dean, thanks so much. Yeah, you know, I think in a way, the wolf warrior diplomacy is an expression of a moment of a kind of desperate opportunism. In a sense, I think that as many countries have caught on to the scope of Beijing's ambitions and have started to push back where they think, where the community of nations thinks that they go too far or are damaging to countries' sovereignty or interests. I think the process of pushing back has led to a bit of a dropping of the fig leaf, if you will, and this more combative approach to diplomacy. It's a more coercive and approach to diplomacy. So I think that what all countries need to do, and this is for the sake of stability, by the way, this is in the interest of reestablishing a kind of equilibrium and more constructive, results-oriented relationship between China and the community of nations. I think that the two ideas that I talked about in the speech and that are central to President Trump's approach, the reciprocity, but also the candor, will help go quite some way in restoring that balance.
Thank you, brilliant. And I've been asked to ask the question on behalf of David Brunstrom of Reuters, and the question he wants to ask is, how would you expect US policy under a second Trump administration to evolve, and how it would differ from the policy that a Biden administration might pursue?
Yeah, so I'll let people advising Vice President Biden talk about what he thinks a good policy would be. But in terms of President Trump's approach, I think first you have to take stock of the fact that there is a new consensus, and the forging of that new consensus about China is something that has happened under President Trump's watch. It is in no small part because of the policies that he's taken. And the result has been that it is actually, as you alluded to in the introductory remarks, Dean, it's a bipartisan, it's a whole of society consensus. And as you read polls popping up all over the world, you see that it's not just an American consensus anymore either. We've led that consensus. That's been President Trump's hallmark. Probably what the most key legacy and shift in American foreign policy in quite some time. But there are a lot of other countries that are now starting to, at a minimum, share a very similar consensus on the sort of the diagnosis of what the problem is. And increasingly, a lot of other countries are European allies across the Indo-Pacific region and beyond, who are exploring and in some cases taking similar steps to those that President Trump has advocated for.
Brilliant. Thank you. And next questioner up, Right Honourable Lord Mandelson, former Deputy Prime Minister and European Commissioner. Peter, your question, if you can come in.
Dean, thank you very much indeed, and I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear, Peter.
I'm been rather impressed by Matt Pottinger's lecture, and I find myself actually a supporter of both reciprocity and candor. And as somebody who, when I was Trade Commissioner, was equally accused of using confrontational rhetoric towards China when I described them as a trade juggernaut out of control, I can see its usefulness. Can I ask, though, this question to Mr. Pottinger? For China, in a sense, to lose, the West has to win. And the West has not been winning during the last 4 years. With sort of due sort of humility and self-criticism, could Mr. Pottinger explain to us why he thinks the West has not been strengthened in its coherence and its unity during the last 4 years, and why we have been less able to act in a joined up way towards China and other international questions than we have during other periods since the Second World War?
Thank you. Matt.
Sir, thank you. That's a great question. You had a great, thoughtful prelude to the question as well. Thank you. Look, President Trump came in following what I believe, and certainly the people who elected him believed, was a lengthy period of failure in American foreign policy, and really more of a failure of the broader foreign policy of the West. We got involved in lengthy wars under sort of I think a misimpression that we would be able to inject democracy into far corners of the earth by the barrel of a gun. Those have been enormously costly. I think that those are things that have really have done damage, I think, to the West. China's entry into the WTO and all of the policies that really the assumptions that led to that, and I shared those assumptions 20 years ago, so I don't blame or cast aspersions for what was actually a very optimistic, bold policy taken by the United States and the West to try to help China become more liberal, first economically, and then we hoped politically as well. But we've got to, I think we've now taken stock of the fact that some of those assumptions were generous, but misplaced. And in fact, when really the high watermark of China's opening and liberalization was December 11th, 2001, which I think was the day that China entered the WTO. After that, all of those reforms that we so eagerly anticipated by bringing China into the WTO actually flatlined. Things started to plateau for about a decade, and then over the course of the decade that we've just concluded, we saw those reforms go into reverse. We've seen a far greater concentration of power into the hands of the state over the economy, over people's lives. And what we've learned is that we actually, that optimistic period, the reform and opening period, if you like, was unfortunately an interregnum. It was an interregnum between the totalitarianism of Mao's rule and a new technologically enhanced totalitarianism under the current leadership. I've heard some refer to it as an attempt at so-called exquisite totalitarianism. I think that's a good encapsulation of what is now being attempted, this experiment that Beijing is running to see whether or not it can improve on the failed approach of all of the other Leninist states of the 20th century by compensating for the failures of those systems through advanced technology and totalitarian surveillance. So in short, I think that this period that you're referring to, that you characterize as as sort of insufficient pulling together of the West, you've got to have a little bit of historical perspective that we're going through a massive change from the post-Cold War era of the last few decades to a new one that takes stock of some of the failures of the last 30 years. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. Next on, Deborah Haynes, foreign editor, Sky News. Deborah, are you coming in?
Hopefully. Hi.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Thank you for letting me ask a question, and thank you for that fascinating presentation. In terms of how you were describing the way that the United Front is sort of implementing China's policies, is what we're seeing now, given that China is this rising power, a kind of a global battle over ideologies? I mean, there's no rule book that says that China has to adopt the rules-based system and carry on using it if it's the predominant power. And if that's the case, then could you just spell out what the danger is if liberal democracies, who are far more fractured now than they have been, if they don't stand together and stand up for the ideologies of free speech and human rights and all the things that we sort of believe in, that you will see this global division between those who side with China technologically and ideologically and those who side with the West, much more than we've ever seen before. Thank you.
Matt.
No, that's also a great question. So, American foreign policy has had this element, a tradition of sort of realpolitik, which is there are nations that calculate on the basis of their own cold self-interest, and also running in our veins is this tradition of our own revolutionary liberal democratic worldview, and they run in our veins like ice water and hot water, and hopefully they remain in good enough balance that your blood stays at a good temperature. But you've hit on something. The truth is that you cannot ignore the ideological dimensions, and ideology is just a fancy word for worldview, right? We do have a markedly different worldview from the Chinese Communist Party, a different approach to the world, different ideas about quite a lot. And that's not true of China as a whole. The Chinese Communist Party is firmly in command of China, obviously, but China is a lot of things. It's a pretty remarkable civilization that I devoted a huge part of my adult life to living in and studying and enjoying, and I still do. The history, the culture, and the unbelievable drive and energy and entrepreneurialism of the Chinese people. But that ideological dimension is unavoidable, and if we try to ignore it, if we try to pretend that it's only a matter of cold self-interest on both sides, that it's a so-called Thucydides trap, as some like to frame it, I think we actually put ourselves on a path towards a more destabilized future than if we were to talk quite frankly to ourselves, our allies, and yes, to our adversaries about those differences, so that we can avoid miscalculation.
Thank you, Matt. Next question from Alexander Downer, our Chairman of Trustees here at Policy Exchange, and of course previously the longest serving Australian Foreign Minister in the country's history and High Commissioner in London. Alexander.
Thanks, Dean. Matt, hope you can hear me. I think, speaking as an Australian, it has to be said that we Australians had a fairly solid, although not tension-free, relationship with China for many years under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And Australians have been really taken aback by the aggression in recent years of the Xi Jinping administration. So my question is a little bit like Peter Mandelson's. If there's a second Trump administration, what specific steps will the United States be taking to help countries like Australia, which have been targeted by China, particularly Australian trade has been targeted by China, to help build a sense of collective security amongst liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific region?
Matt.
Yeah, it's a great remark that you made, and Australia has been, in some senses, the canary in the coal mine. Australia, by the way, when people claim that provocative and frank, candid language is what causes China to act out in this sort of wolf warrior way, I always point to Australia as well as India as the counter examples there, because India and Australia are two countries that had really went out of their way to extend warmth to China in their people-to-people and commercial ties. These were countries that did seek to integrate their economies, certainly, especially in the case of Australia. And yet, when the Australian government just earlier this year had the temerity to ask the World Health Organization whether there could be a general investigation into the origins of this coronavirus, China retaliated for that wholly reasonable request that Australia made. And by the way, the World Health Organization members voted in the largest majority in the organization's history in favor of the motion that Australia raised to investigate the origins of, how is it that millions of us now have been infected with this disease. China retaliated by putting tariffs on Australian barley, canceling beef exports, and describing their sort of arch propagandist said Australia is chewing gum stuck to the bottom of China's shoe and it's time to scrape it off. So there you have, I think, a pretty good counter argument to the idea that the notion that by being extra friendly to China and hiding some of our candor, the idea that would lead to a happier bilateral relationship is not just doesn't stand up. That sense of that building a sense of solidarity, I like the way that you put it, a sense of collective action, actually, I think you put it, is exactly right. And President Trump signed a national security strategy in 2017 and a series of sub-strategies, some of which are public, some are not. The one public one I'd refer you to is a White House statement that we published just this spring called The U.S. Approach to the People's Republic of China. It's a very straightforward, plain-spoken document about the assumptions that we've had to modify about China's ambitions and intentions. And part of the approach is first to work closely with allies, as we've been doing, to ensure that we do not overly rely on supply chains being rooted in one country in particular. It's not good policy to put all of our eggs in one basket. So we're working carefully, and that will be, I think, at the heart of a second-term agenda. But I also wanted to point out that you remember that there was a kerfuffle during the last election campaign over the idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a multilateral trading organization. It had a very good, I think, objective. The objective, I hope I'm not misspeaking, you'll get to talk to Kurt Campbell when he gives remarks, and he's someone who knows this better than anyone. But I think that one of the overarching objectives was avoid a scenario where all of the countries of Asia become totally dependent on China for their trade and their economic prosperity. By increasing trade with the West, with the United States, so that all those countries, in a sense, can hedge. They can feel that they've got security in their trading relations globally. We support the objective, as I just stated it, but not the methodology. And the bottom line was that the American people lost faith in the idea of multilateral trading bodies, and that's why both candidates in the 2016 presidential election turned their backs on the TPP. But what we've done instead is work on bilateral trade relations. Okay, so President Trump modified the NAFTA agreement. He modified the Korea Free Trade Agreement and struck a new trade agreement with Japan. So Japan would have been 90% of America's trade with the TPP countries. And now we have a solid bilateral free trade agreement with Japan that can be built upon further. And what has happened with the president's the tariffs that he put on China to impose costs on China's rampant theft for decades of American intellectual property, those tariffs had the salutary effect of driving more investment as well as more trade away from China and into those same countries, those TPP countries that we're talking about. So you've actually ended up serving a very similar objective to what people were trying to achieve through TPP, but through bilateral trade agreements. Bilateral trade agreements are easier to enforce. They leave the U.S. with more flexibility so that if one country is cheating, we can apply remedies against that country without having to violate the rules of an entire or withdraw from an entire body of 11 or 12 countries. So that's an eminently reasonable thing. And the president gets accused often of being overly bilateral, but I just want to mention one point that I never see in the press, which is that the European Union has something above 70 bilateral free trade agreements with the world, which is about 3 times the number of bilateral free trade agreements that the United States has. So yeah, part of a second-term agenda is very much about building on those dynamics that are now in play to build, as you put it, that sense of collective security and collective prosperity.
Thank you, Matt. Because time is short, I'd just like the last question to be taken as a brace of question from 2 people who stuck up their hand, been patient, Martha Ganiza and Dominic Lawson. Martha, Dominic, and then Matt, if you can answer them, as an ensemble before we wind up. Thank you. Martha, Dominic. Dominic, you want to go ahead first.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yes. First of all, Matthew, congratulations on a brilliant and, in fact, moving speech. It was intensely moral, and you quoted President Reagan, it was entirely moral. I'm afraid that President Trump, his message to China is exactly what you said we shouldn't do, which is it's all about self-interest. It is only about trade, and he has never mentioned religious minorities or the Uyghurs. And I wonder, therefore, if you are right, which I think you are, that the battle has to be conducted at the level of morality, what prospect this opens up for a victory in that ideological war if there is a second Trump administration?
You want to go take that, Matt?
I think that, oh, sure. No, thank you. If you look at the totality of President Trump's foreign policy, the moral component, if you look at the actions that President Trump has taken, the policies that he has put into effect, the moral component is unmistakable. It is unmistakable. Whether it was the speech that he gave at the National Assembly in Seoul in 2017, comparing North and South Korea, I'd refer you to that. It was it was Reagan-esque in many respects, and a deeply moral speech. Whether it was enforcing red lines that had been drawn but hadn't been enforced on the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people by their own government, on twice now that the president has enforced that line, and done it within the framework of a moral imperative. If you look at the fact, here's another one that I've never seen reported, by the way, in the news. The Trump administration is the only government on earth that has imposed costs, concrete costs, on the People's Republic of China for the concentration camps in Xinjiang. President Trump approved back in October of 2019 first, so a full year ago, he began taking action on this issue. He put in place export bans on companies and organizations that are complicit in building those camps and that the system that is being built in Xinjiang. He followed up with import bans on products coming from that part of the world, including tons of human hair that was processed by, and we fear, also shaved from the heads of Uyghur prisoners in China's camps. He then followed up with that by putting Treasury Department sanctions on a sitting member of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo, as well as other people who are complicit in building these camps and this system. So if you look at what President Trump does and not what the media says, I think that the moral component cannot be denied.
Matt, thank you. I'm afraid that's it for now. It's been a brilliant and memorable Crampthorne lecture. There's an old line in Whitehall, choose your predecessor with care, and you've set a phenomenally high bar for all our speakers for this keynote address of ours in the years to come. Combination of your record of action, thought, and as a bureaucratic warrior makes you formidable indeed. Everyone, I think British audience is seeing this for the first time today, and many others across the world will endorse that sentiment. So thank you, Matt. Thank you for honouring the memory of our friend Colin Crampthorne, and look forward to welcoming you all back next week for the address by Kurt Campbell in part 2 of the Crampthorne Memorial Lecture. And thank you all for coming in. Over and out.
Thanks, Dean. Out.